You think you're a good person, kind, patient, empathetic. You pride yourself on your emotional control, on how you never lose your temper, on how understanding you are, how conflict averse, how peaceful. But what if everything you believe about yourself is a carefully constructed lie? What if beneath that calm exterior, there's something darker, more volatile, more dangerous than you want to admit? Morgan was that person, the friend everyone called stable, the colleague who never complained, the partner who always understood she had spent 31 years building an identity around being good, and she believed it completely until one day she didn't. It started with small cracks, a disproportionate rage when someone cut her off in traffic, a cruel thought about a friend's failure that she enjoyed more than she wanted to admit, a moment of seeing her partner talk to someone attractive and feeling hatred, not just jealousy, but actual hatred. And each time these moments happened, she would push them down, tell herself, "That's not who I am. That was just a bad moment. I'm not really like that." But the moments kept coming more frequently, more intensely, and she started to wonder, what if there's a part of me I'd know? What if the person I think I am is just a mask? And what if what's underneath is something I've been terrified to see? This is what Carl Jung called the shadow. And it's not a metaphor. It's not a philosophical concept. It's a real psychological force operating in your unconscious mind, your choices, sabotaging your relationships, controlling your reactions, and you don't even know it's there because you've spent your entire life pretending it doesn't exist. Your shadow wasn't born dark. It was born natural, authentic, whole. You were a child with all your emotions intact. Anger, sadness, joy, aggression, desire, all of it. Valid, all of it. Human. But then the pruning began. Boys don't cry. Good girls don't get angry. Stop being so loud. That's selfish. You should be tamed. Nice people don't feel that way. And piece by piece you learned which parts of yourself were acceptable and which had to be hidden. Morgan remembers the exact moment her shadow started forming. She was 6 years old, angry about something her mother said, and she threw a toy across the room. Mother's face went cold. That's disgusting behavior. We don't act like that in this family. You're better than this. And Morgan learned anger equals bad. Morgan equals bad. If Morgan shows anger, therefore Morgan must never show anger again. So she didn't. She buried it, pushed it down deep, and told herself she wasn't an angry person. But the anger didn't disappear. It just went underground. And every time she denied it, every time she said, "I'm fine," when she wasn't, every time she smiled through frustration, swallowed resentment, performed patience, she didn't actually feel the shadow grew stronger, fed everything she refused to acknowledge. And this is how it works for everyone. The shadow is composed of everything you've rejected in yourself. Not just the objectively bad things, but also the natural human things that your family, your culture, your environment taught you were unacceptable. And what those parts are buried. They don't just sit there quietly. They ferment, they mutate. They find other ways to express themselves through your judgments of others, through your self-sabotage, through those moments when you surprise yourself by how you react, and you think, where did that come from? From your shadow. You don't see your shadow directly. You see it in your reactions, in your patterns, in the things you can't explain. Morgan started noticing hers everywhere. That colleague who was confident and assertive, Everything Morgan pretended she didn't want to be Morgan found herself criticizing her, calling her aggressive, bossy. Too much when really what Morgan felt was envy, that friend who was going through a breakup. Morgan offered support, said all the right things, but felt a small dark satisfaction that someone else's life was falling apart too. That stranger on social media with different political views. Morgan felt disproportionate rage, not disagreement. Rage, hatred. The desire to hurt with words, and each time she would tell herself these reactions were justified. The colleague really was too aggressive. The friend kind of had it coming. The stranger really did deserve her contempt. But Jung would say, no. These reactions are projections. What you cannot accept in yourself, you will condemn in others. The confidence you've repressed appears as aggression in someone else. The schadenfreude you won't acknowledge pretends to be concern. The rage you've buried finds socially acceptable targets. And this is how the shadow operates: through the back door, through the mechanisms. You don't examine through the justifications. You don't question, because looking directly at your shadow means admitting things about yourself you've spent your whole life denying. It means acknowledging that you're not as kind you think, not as patient, not as understanding, not as good. And that truth is terrifying. So you keep not looking, and the shadow keeps growing, keeps controlling your life from the unconscious, keeps sabotaging relationships, creating conflicts, generating suffering. And you keep calling it bad luck, other people's faults, or just how life is. But it's none of those things. It's you, the part of you that you refuse to see. Here's the most dangerous trap: people who identify strongly as good people often have the darkest shadows, because the more you invest in being good, the more you have to repress everything that doesn't fit that identity. Morgan had built her entire personality around being the understanding one, emotionally mature one, the one who never lost control, and that identity felt safe. It earned her praise, made her feel superior, gave her a sense of moral high ground. But it was a prison, because maintaining it required constant vigilance, constant suppression, constant denial of anything contradicted the good person narrative. She couldn't admit anger, because good people don't get angry. She couldn't acknowledge envy, because good people are happy for others' success. She couldn't express her sexual desires, because good people are modest and controlled. She couldn't be ambitious, good people are humble. She couldn't set hard boundaries, because good people are accommodating. And with each denied impulse, the shadow grew denser, more powerful, more ready to explode, because Jung understood something crucial. The brighter the persona, the darker the shadow. And people who present themselves as entirely good, as having transcended their darker nature, as being spiritually evolved, emotionally enlightened, morally superior, are often the ones most possessed by their shadows. They're like pressure cookers. All that denied energy building, and when it finally releases, not gentle, it's not controlled, it's catastrophic. Morgan saw this in herself. One day, her partner made a small, thoughtless comment, and she exploded. Years of repressed anger came pouring out, cruel words she didn't know she was capable of saying. Rage that seemed to come from nowhere. A version of herself she didn't recognize. And afterwards, sitting in the wreckage of that explosion, she had to face the truth. She wasn't the good person she thought she was. She was a person with both light and darkness, who had spent decades denying half of her humanity. And that denial had made her more dangerous, not less. Once you start seeing your shadow, you can't unsee it. Morgan began noticing patterns everywhere. That judgment she had about shallow people revealed her own repressed desire for superficial pleasures. That criticism of people who needed attention revealed her own unmet need to be seen. That disdain for emotional people revealed her own denied vulnerability. Every strong negative reaction she had toward others was a signpost pointing toward something in herself she hadn't integrated. And Jung was right. What irritates us in others leads us to understanding ourselves. But this understanding is painful because it means admitting you're not special, you're not better, you're not above the things you criticize, you're actually triggered by them. Precisely because they live in you too. Morgan had spent years judging her sister for being needy, calling her emotionally immature, rolling her eyes at her sister's constant need for reassurance. But when Morgan finally looked at her shadow, she saw her own neediness, her own desperate desire for validation that she'd buried under a performance of independence. And the judgment she directed at her sister was really self-hatred, projected outward. This is the shadow's function in relationships. It shows you yourself through what you reject in others. And until you stop projecting, until you reclaim those disowned parts of yourself, your relationships will be battlegrounds where you fight against aspects of your own psyche that you've externalized onto other people. You'll think you're in conflict with them, but really you're in conflict with yourself. There are moments when the shadow doesn't just whisper from the background. It takes complete control, and you become someone you don't recognize. Morgan had one of these moments at a work meeting. A colleague took credit for her idea, and something inside her snapped. Not just anger, something darker, more primal, more vicious. She didn't just correct the record. She destroyed the colleague publicly, humiliated them, dismantled their credibility, and enjoyed it. And the worst part, she justified it to herself. Afterwards, he deserved it. He was taking credit for my work. I was just standing up for myself. But that wasn't standing up for herself. That was her shadow. Unleashed years of repressed aggression, finding a socially acceptable target and obliterating it. And this is what Jung warned about. The shadow doesn't want to destroy you, it wants to be acknowledged. But when you ignore it long enough, you pretend it doesn't exist. When you keep pushing it down, eventually it doesn't ask for permission anymore. It just takes over, and when it does, you're not in control. The shadow is this is why seemingly good people commit terrible acts. Not because they're secretly evil, but because they've repressed their darkness so completely that when it finally emerges, they have no relationship with it, no ability to modulate it, no consciousness around it. They're possessed, and possession feels like you're watching yourself from outside, like someone else is operating your body, like you're capable of things you never thought possible. And afterwards you'll say, I don't know what came over me. I wasn't myself. But you were yourself. You were just the part of yourself you've been denying for so long that when it finally appeared, you had no idea how to integrate. In 1971, psychologist Philip Zimbardo proved something terrifying. Given the right conditions, ordinary good people will become cruel. College students with no history of violence or cruelty were randomly assigned to be guards or prisoners in a simulated prison. And within days, the guards were psychologically abusing the prisoners, humiliating them, depriving them of sleep, imposing arbitrary punishments. The experiment had to be stopped early because the cruelty escalated so quickly. And these weren't bad people. They were normal students who in any other context would be considered decent, moral, but the situation gave their shadows permission to emerge, and once given permission, the shadow didn't hesitate. Morgan understood this viscerally because she saw how easily she could become cruel, how little it took to justify behavior. She would normally condemn how quickly her moral standards adjusted when she was the one acting from darkness. Zimbardo called it the Lucifer effect, the transformation of good to evil. And what Jung would add is that this transformation is only possible because the evil was already there, just repressed. The good person and the cruel person, different people, they're the same person, with different levels of consciousness about their shadow. The students in the prison experiment didn't become monsters. They just stopped pretending they weren't capable of monstrosity. And that's the terrifying truth about human nature. We're all capable of cruelty. We're all capable of harm. We're all capable of things we claim we'd never do. The only question is whether we're conscious of this capacity, and therefore able to choose differently, or unconscious of it, and therefore controlled by it. When conditions aligned, Morgan realized she'd been trigger away from becoming someone unrecognizable. Not because she was bad, but because she'd never acknowledged how much darkness she carried. So what do you do when you finally see your shadow? When you can't deny it anymore, when you understand that the darkness isn't happening to you, it's happening from within? Jung's answer is integration, not elimination, not denial, not suppression. Integration means acknowledging the shadow, accept that it's part of you, and consciously deciding how to relate to it. Morgan started with the hardest step, admitting what she'd been denying. She wrote in a journal, without censorship, all the thoughts she'd never said out loud. I enjoyed seeing my friend fail. I felt satisfaction when that colleague got fired. I sometimes hate my partner for no reason. I judge people constantly to feel superior. I have cruel thoughts about people I claim to love. And writing these truths without immediately following them with, but I'm not really like that, or that doesn't define me, was excruciating, because she could hide behind qualifications, couldn't soften it, couldn't make herself look better. She had to just sit with the truth of her darkness. And something unexpected happened when she stopped fighting. It stopped fearing it, stopped pretending it wasn't there. The shadow lost some of its power, because the shadow doesn't want to destroy you. It wants to be seen, and when you finally look at it directly, when you say, yes, this is also part of me, when you stop the exhausting performance of only being good, something shifts. You become more whole, more honest, more real. You don't become more evil. You become more conscious, and consciousness is what allows you to choose, because you can't choose how to respond to your anger. If you're pretending you're not angry, you can't manage your envy. If you're denying it exists, you can't set boundaries around your cruelty. If you're convinced you're incapable of cruelty, integration means ending the war with yourself, accepting all of who you are, and from that acceptance, making conscious choices about how to. Integration isn't a one-time event. It's a continuous practice, because the shadow doesn't disappear once acknowledged. It just becomes visible. And managing something visible is different from being controlled by something invisible. Morgan found that after acknowledging her shadow, she still felt anger, still felt envy, still had cruel thoughts. But now she could see them forming, could observe them without immediately acting from them. And that observation created space for choice before she would go from trigger to reaction instantly. Someone would slight her and she'd respond with cruelty before even registering what was happening. But now there was a pause. She could feel the shadow rising, could notice the cruel response forming, could see exactly what she was about to do, and in that seeing could choose differently. Sometimes she still chose the shadow's response, but now it was a choice, not possession. And other times, she could choose differently, could acknowledge the feeling without acting from it, could say to herself, I'm feeling enraged right now, without letting the rage dictate her behavior. This is what Jung meant by making the unconscious conscious. It doesn't make you perfect, doesn't eliminate your darkness, doesn't transform you into the good person you once pretended to be, but it gives you authorship over your life. Instead of being a puppet of unconscious forces, you become someone who knows themselves fully, and from that knowledge acts with intention, not impulse more. Also learn to use her shadow as information. What am I judging in others right now? What's that showing me about myself? When she noticed herself being critical of someone's neediness, she'd pause and ask, where am I being needy that I won't admit? When she felt schadenfreude, she'd ask, where do I feel like I'm failing? That makes someone else's failure, satisfying the shadow, became a compass, pointing toward her own unmet needs, unacknowledged feelings, unexplored desires. Instead of the enemy, it became a guide. But this only works if you keep looking, if you stay vigilant, if you don't slip back into the comfortable delusion that you're only. So here's where Morgan arrived. After confronting her shadow, after integrating what she'd spent her life denying, after accepting that she's not the good person she thought she was, she found something unexpected: freedom. Because the exhausting performance finally ended, she didn't have to pretend anymore, didn't have to maintain the illusion, didn't have to live in constant fear that her darkness would be exposed. It was already exposed to the person who mattered most, herself. And, paradoxically, accepting her darkness made her kinder. Not the performed kindness of someone trying to prove good, but the real kindness of someone who knows they're capable of cruelty and consciously chooses otherwise. She could set boundaries now without guilt, because she wasn't trying to be the understanding one anymore. She could feel anger without shame, because she knew anger wasn't the enemy. Denying it was. She could be honest in relationships, because she wasn't trying to seem perfect. And people responded to this new honesty. Some people, uncomfortable with that level of truth, pulled away, preferred the performed version. But the people who stayed connected with her more deeply than before, they were finally meeting the real her, not the persona. Morgan learned that the light isn't found by denying the darkness. It's found by accepting that both exist in you and choosing consciously which one to act from, moment by moment. And that choice, that consciousness, that integration is the only real freedom. Because you're no longer at war with yourself, no longer exhausting yourself, maintaining an illusion, no longer controlled by parts of yourself. You won't acknowledge your whole, messy, complicated, capable of both beauty and ugliness, and finally honest about all of it. And if you're reading this recognizing yourself in Morgan's story, feeling that uncomfortable recognition that you too have been hiding from your shadow, then you're at the beginning of something important, not the end. The question isn't are you good or bad, the question is are you conscious or unconscious. Consciousness, the willingness to see yourself fully, is the hardest, most liberating work you'll ever do. So what part of your shadow are you still hiding? What darkness are you pretending doesn't exist? Comment below, because naming it is the first step toward integrating it, and this work doesn't happen alone. It happens through honest conversation, through shared recognition, through the courage to say, me too. I have this darkness too. Watch the next video. It's waiting for you, because this journey doesn't end. It deep